Chapter 20, Omnist Hill. Omnism, since it apparently needs spelling out, is the idea that no single belief system has a monopoly on truth, that wisdom, meaning, and insight aren't owned by one God, one book, one prophet, one culture, or one century, that faith is not a team sport, that you don't win spirituality by picking a side and shouting louder than everyone else. In simpler terms, it's the acceptance that many paths point at the same horizon, and that pretending otherwise is usually more about fear than conviction. To the devout, this sounds like heresy. To the cynical, it sounds like indecision. To the lazy, it sounds like fence sitting. And to a dragon Capricorn mind that has torn through belief systems the same way it's torn through people, ideas, and institutions that couldn't stand up to scrutiny, it's just practical. Omnism isn't about believing everything. It's about refusing to believe only one thing. Danny's relationship with faith was never clean, never linear, and never obedient. It started where it often does, in a parish school under Christian doctrine. Hymns, prayers, saints, sacrifice. Not forced exactly, not embraced either. It was simply there, a framework handed to him before he was old enough to question it. For a time, it worked well enough. The stories had weight, the rituals had rhythm. The idea of something greater watching from above made a kind of sense. But by his teens, belief stopped behaving. Christian certainty gave way to superstition. Traveler tarot, charms, symbols, half-believed rituals passed between people rather than scripture. Not because he was searching for truth, but because he was curious. Because his mind wanted perspective, not obedience. That curiosity widened. Buddhism followed, then Taoism, then philosophies brushing close to Hinduism. Never devotion, never submission, just fascination. Cycles, balance, impermanence, suffering, detachment, rebirth. None of it demanded allegiance. It invited thought, and thinking was always the point. As he grew older, the scope expanded again. Paganism, Norse gods, Celtic gods, Druids, Native American stories, Aboriginal dreamtime, old gods, forgotten gods, gods that weren't moral judges but forces, gods that weren't clean or gentle but honest, gods of war, seasons, death, storms, harvests, trickery, especially the Norse, the sagas, the inevitability, the idea that even gods fall but fight anyway, that fate isn't avoided, only met, that struck something deep and permanent in him. And then it stopped being just intellectual. He felt drawn to places, stone circles, ancient barrows, old woodlands, hilltops where rituals once stood, ruins built for pilgrimage, places where belief had been done, not written, places where people had stood long before him and tried to understand existence using nothing but story, symbol, and firelight. On the outside, Danny walked these places without fully knowing why, just that they felt right, familiar, anchoring. So inside his mind there was only one place this could live. Not a chamber, not a room, not behind walls or under ceilings. A hill. Omnist Hill rises within the fortress walls, not outside them, because belief for Danny is internal. It is processed, it is known, it is part of him. Everything beyond the fortress is noise until it crosses the threshold. This hill has already crossed it. It is the second tallest place within the mind fortress. It doesn't dominate, it doesn't rule, it overlooks. From Omnist Hill, paths radiate inward. Shrines stand beside stone circles. Altars exist without hierarchy. Gods share space without conflict. No single truth demands obedience. No story is crowned supreme. This isn't religion. It's reverence without allegiance. Omnist Hill exists because Danny never chose one God, one faith, one doctrine. He chose all of them, not to worship, but to listen, to learn, to understand how different cultures answered the same questions using different language. Where else would this belong? Not the library. Belief doesn't like being dissected. Not the court. Faith isn't evidence-based. Not the war room. Devotion isn't strategic. It belongs somewhere elevated, open, grounded. A place where belief doesn't argue with belief. Where stories sit side by side without needing to win. Where meaning matters more than correctness. Inside the fortress, but closer to the sky. And up here, belief stops being about answers and becomes about perspective. Here, the landscape changes tone. On Omnist Hill, there is an old church, stone still standing, roof half given back to the sky. It is rarely visited now, and when it is, it's not for worship. It's for dissection, for picking apart doctrine, for explaining why it no longer holds authority. People don't come here to believe. They come to justify disbelief. And the building accepts that quietly, like something that has already finished its work. Around it, the rest of the hill never pretended to be orderly. Gypsy wagons sit at the tree line, wheels sunk into the earth as if they've always been there. Witches gather near small fires, not theatrical, not performative, practical. Superstition lives here without apology. Charms, symbols, half-truths. Old magic that doesn't ask to be proven because it never claimed certainty in the first place. Further up the slope, the gods are not housed in books, they walk. Not as abstractions or metaphors, but as characters, voices from sagas, scriptures, myths Danny has read and reread. Norse figures telling stories as if they happened yesterday. Druids speaking in riddles that don't resolve neatly. Deities from distant cultures sitting beside one another without conflict, because this place was never about hierarchy. This isn't a library. Nothing here is filed. Nothing here is cited. Nothing here needs to be proven. Stone circles rise from the ground where arguments stop and listening begins. Altars stand without instruction. Shrines exist without explanation. Every object here carries meaning that can't be verified, only felt. And that's the point. This place sits above Danny in a way the library never does. The library is knowledge he can check, facts he can cross-reference, things he has seen, learned, verified, tested. The hill holds what cannot be confirmed or denied, what can't be argued into submission, what exists outside certainty. When Danny comes here, he doesn't arrive as a king, he comes as himself. No throne, no authority, no ego. The king does not walk this hill. Danny comes here stripped of bias, stripped of perspective, stripped of idealism. He doesn't bring conclusions. He doesn't bring demands. He doesn't come to rule. He comes to listen. Here he is closer to a pilgrim than a god. He sits, he meditates, he prays, not to one thing, but to understanding itself. He listens to stories he already knows, but hears them told back to him by the very beings those stories came from, not as references, not as doctrine, as living narratives. This place is not under his control, and that is why it matters. Omnist Hill exists because Danny understands something instinctively. That belief, when forced into ownership, rots. That faith, when ruled, lies. So he comes here humbly, quietly, willingly beneath something greater. Not greater in power, but greater in mystery. And in doing so, he allows guidance without surrender, perspective without obedience, meaning without chains. And once you become aware of Omnist Hill, you start to notice it everywhere. Because when Danny is sitting on the external reading tarot cards, casting runes, meditating, reading sagas, scripture, a Bible, a sutra, that is him on Omnist Hill. That's not symbolism. That's not metaphor. That's the location his mind moves to when he does those things. That's him sitting on the hill amongst the gods. When he reads the runes, he reads them the way a seer would. When he pulls tarot, he does it the way a psychic would. Not performative, not for show, not trying to convince anyone. It's quiet, it's deliberate, it's receptive. And when he does that, something very specific happens. The external act becomes a channel. Information flows inward, not as facts, not as conclusions, as signals. Sometimes the messages are fragmented, sometimes they come whole, sometimes they arrive as riddles, symbols, images that make no sense at the time. Sometimes they contradict what he wants to hear entirely. And sometimes they tell him things he has never consciously thought before, things that feel foreign, intrusive, ancient, or uncomfortably precise. That's the part most people don't understand. When Danny talks to the gods, he isn't talking about them. He isn't role-playing belief. He isn't pretending. He is listening. Those instruments, the cards, the runes, the texts, don't create the message. They give the message somewhere to land. They translate something ineffable into a form the mind can hold without breaking. And once that information enters, it doesn't go to the library. It doesn't go to the court. It doesn't go to the war room. It stays on the hill. It becomes a conversation between Danny and whatever met him there. That's why it takes time to understand. That's why it can't be rushed. The messages aren't instructions. They're relationships. Danny has to sit with them, walk with them, argue with them, let them echo, let them return in different forms, let them unfold. And that process, working out what a god meant, what a symbol pointed to, what a story was really saying, that's the real work, not obedience, interpretation. Omnist Hill doesn't give answers, it gives alignment. And when Danny leaves the hill, he doesn't leave with certainty. He leaves with direction, subtle, shifting, incomplete, but felt, something that can't be proven, but also can't be ignored. That's why this place exists. Because some truths don't belong in books, some guidance doesn't submit to logic, and some conversations can only happen when the ego steps aside and listens. And it's important to understand that Omnist Hill isn't built on blind faith. That's exactly why it's a hill. A hill is solid, grounded, earned. It exists because enough weight has been placed there over time that it can no longer be dismissed as imagination. This place didn't appear because Danny woke up one day and decided to believe in something. It wasn't inherited unquestioned from Christianity, even though he was raised in a parish school. It wasn't adopted just because he read Norse sagas, Buddhist texts, Taoist philosophy, or pagan lore. If that were the case, it would all still live in the clouds, abstract, theoretical, safely stored in the library as ideas. But this didn't stay theoretical. Throughout Danny's life, on the external, people have said things to him, unprompted, unrelated to ego, often from strangers, at gatherings, at pagan festivals, at magic fairs, in quiet conversations with people who barely knew him, people with no reason to flatter him, no investment in his identity, no shared history. Again and again, he's been told some version of the same thing. There's something about you. You're not just normal. You see things differently. You already know this, don't you? And even then, even with that repetition, he didn't trust it. Not enough to let it inflate him. Not enough to let it become performance or fantasy. Not enough to let it turn into identity. So instead, he grounded it. Even now, on the external, Danny visits a respected, well-known psychic once a year. Every year. Not for answers, not for reassurance, not for direction, but as a check, a calibration, a way of saying don't trust yourself blindly. And that psychic, year after year, has told him the same thing, that he doesn't need to be there, that he's capable of doing this himself, that whatever he's tapping into, he's already listening to it clearly. Danny doesn't take that as proof of greatness. He doesn't take it as validation of ego. He doesn't build an identity around it. He takes it as structural reinforcement. Another stone added to the hill. Because when something is echoed back to you consistently from the outside, from unrelated sources, across years, across contexts, the mind can no longer dismiss it as coincidence. It has to be placed somewhere. It has to be accounted for. That's what Omnist Hill is. Not belief, not devotion, not fantasy. It's the place where external validation, internal experience, and repeated pattern converge into something the mind can no longer deny, but also refuses to worship. That's why the hill is humble. Danny doesn't come here as a god. He doesn't come here as a king. He comes here as a listener. The hill exists because the world kept knocking on the same door. And eventually, the mind had to build a place to answer it. And the beings on the hill, the gods, the figures, the presences, they aren't there because Danny chose them. They're there because something keeps speaking through them. That's where we pause. Because there is more on this hill. Not all of it spiritual, not all of it divine. And what comes next changes how this place functions entirely. On this hill, it isn't only gods that gather. Danny's own internal characters walk these paths as well. The ones that needed a place higher than logic, but lower than blind belief. The parts of him that live between psychology and spirituality, between grounding and wonder. One of the most prominent presences here is skepticism. Skepticism isn't here to dismantle faith. It's here to anchor it. It walks Omnist Hill with arms folded, asking uncomfortable questions, checking foundations, making sure nothing drifts off into fantasy unchecked. Without skepticism, the hill would dissolve into imagination. With it, the hill stays solid. Beside it moves discernment, quieter, sharper. Discernment doesn't ask whether something is real or not. It asks whether it's relevant, useful, timed correctly. It filters messages. It separates metaphor from instruction. It's the reason not every sign becomes prophecy. Not every coincidence becomes destiny. There is curiosity here too, but not the restless, pattern-hunting curiosity of the library. This is curiosity with patience. Curiosity that listens to stories, not to catalog them, but to feel them. It keeps Danny open without making him naive. Humility has a rare and genuine presence on this hill. Not performative humility, not false modesty, but the quiet understanding that whatever exists here is bigger than personal identity. This is why Danny comes here without ego, why he kneels instead of commands, why he listens instead of declares. Then there is intuition, not mystical, not dramatic, just deeply embodied. Intuition here doesn't shout. It settles in the chest or the gut and waits. It's the part of Danny that knows something is right long before it can be explained. Meaning-making walks these paths as well. The instinct that tries to weave experience into narrative without forcing conclusions. It refuses to let life be random noise, but it also refuses to lie to itself for comfort. Omnist Hill exists because this instinct exists. And standing quietly at the edges is boundary. Boundary is what keeps this place from consuming the rest of the fortress. It ensures Omnist Hill is visited, not lived in. That faith informs decisions without dictating them. That spirituality is engaged without becoming obsession. These presences aren't gods. They are functions, psychological roles that allow belief to exist without destabilizing the system. Sharing the space with them are the internally devout, not Danny himself, but parts of him. Aspects that crave ritual, parts soothed by prayer, chant, repetition, symbol, parts that need ceremony, rhythm, reverence, parts that need the idea of something older, something watching, something constant. These parts gather naturally on this hill. They light candles, they sit at shrines, they listen to stories as if they were scripture. They don't argue with skeptics. They don't try to convert anyone. They're not here to prove anything. They're here because they fulfill a need. And that's why Omnist Hill works. Belief here isn't enforced. It's contained, witnessed, and integrated. Danny doesn't worship blindly, but parts of him do. Danny doesn't claim certainty, but parts of him need faith. Danny doesn't reject the divine, but he doesn't surrender to it either. All of it coexists on this hill, because this is the last place in the fortress where Danny approaches something greater than himself without trying to control it. And that matters. Because while Omnist Hill hosts many gods, many stories, many beliefs, the sun and the moon inside the fortress are not stories at all. They are something else entirely. And there are those who know it. Here, that truth settles into place. Because first, the sun is Danny. Everyone on Omnist Hill knows it. Not as ego, not as worship in the human sense, as origin, as fact of their reality. Danny is the one who built the fortress, shaped the hill, raised the walls, placed the stories, carved the paths. Whatever external forces may have influenced him once upon a time are irrelevant here, because the external doesn't exist to them. They don't know it's there. They don't need to. Just as Danny doesn't consciously know most of what's happening inside the fortress while he moves through the world, the inhabitants of the fortress don't know what Danny is doing outside it. That separation is not a flaw. It's the reason the system works. The system is fully contained within itself. So Omnist Hill is not a place of uniform belief. Far from it. There are atheists here, internal presences that reject gods entirely. Parts of Danny that distrust spirituality, dismiss mysticism, question everything that cannot be verified. They walk the hill not to kneel, but to observe, to test, to ensure nothing slips into delusion. There are others who don't even trust external authority, science included. Not because science is wrong, but because internally their function is not to verify the outside world, but to maintain coherence inside it. They don't exist to reflect reality. They exist to stabilize the system. None of these presences need the external world to justify themselves. They are not fragments of belief imported wholesale from outside. They are roles born to serve the internal structure. And then there are those whose faith is different. Those who are devout, not to an external god, not to a religion, not to a myth, but to the sun itself. To Danny. They don't call it ego. They don't see it as supremacy. They see it as origin and continuity. Danny is the source of the world they inhabit. He created the laws. He built the systems. He sustains the structure simply by existing. For them, Danny is God, not in a cosmic sense, but in the only sense that matters to them. And this is where Omnist Hill becomes essential, because without the hill, that belief would metastasize into something dangerous. Without the hill, devotion to the sun could become a god complex. Without the hill, reverence could turn into fanaticism. Without the hill, internal faith might leak outward and distort how Danny relates to the real world. But the hill prevents that. It gives faith a place. It keeps devotion contextual, grounded, witnessed by skepticism, humility, discernment, and boundary. It allows belief to exist without hijacking identity. It lets reverence breathe without becoming control. The devout faith to the sun exists not to elevate Danny above others externally, but to remind the system internally who it serves. And paradoxically, that devotion is what keeps Danny humble. Because here on Omnist Hill, Danny does not stand as king. He does not rule as judge. He does not command as general. He comes as Danny, and by allowing parts of himself to see him as the sun, while other parts question, doubt, observe, and resist, the system balances itself. Faith keeps meaning alive. Skepticism keeps it honest. The hill keeps it contained. And that is why Omnist Hill exists. Not to prove anything, not to convert anyone, not to explain the universe, but to ensure that belief in all its forms has a home. So it never has to spill into places where it would do harm. And above all of it, unseen but always felt, the sun remains what it has always been, the creator of the system, contained by the system, served by the system, and never allowed to forget that it is not the system itself. On Omnist Hill, the moon is not distant. It is believed in. Danny believes in it the same way he believes in everything here, not as doctrine, not as obedience, but as possibility. He does not kneel out of submission. He sits, listens, feels, and allows meaning to take shape. He believes in the sun. He believes in the moon. He believes in gods, stories, symbols, spirits, and contradictions all at once. That is what makes him Omnist. To Danny, the moon is not lesser than the sun. It is necessary. Where the sun gives him identity, strength, and structure, the moon gives him connection. The belief that love exists, that it matters, that it has weight equal to power. On this hill, that belief becomes communal. There are those who gather here who worship the moon openly, not as an object, but as a promise that love survives war, that tenderness survives brutality, that something soft can exist alongside something ferocious without being erased. And Danny is among them, not above them, not apart from them. He sits as a believer, and within that belief, the lunar ghost exists. She is not the moon itself. She is what happens because Danny believes in the moon. She is the embodiment of love that believes back, because this is the part no god can do for him. The lunar ghost is here because she believes in Danny, not in his strength alone, not in his dominance, but in him, the contradictions, the violence, the tenderness, the humor, the grief, the hope. She believes in the dragon as he is, not as something to be fixed or softened. She does not challenge his faith. She does not reshape it. She simply fits within it. And that is why her presence matters. She listens to the stories with him. She hears the myths, the sagas, the prophecies. She feels the same pull, the same gravity, the same quiet knowing. Not because she must, but because she does. And threading through all of this is the echo. On Omnist Hill, the echo does not argue or judge. It resonates. It moves through the chants, the prayers, the silences. It hums beneath belief itself, a low, hypnotic harmony that Danny feels in his chest more than he hears in his ears. Here, the echo feels like magic, not illusion, not fantasy, but that unexplainable alignment when something feels true, even when it cannot be proven. The echo is why Danny believes love exists at all. Not because he can define it, not because he can explain it, but because he can feel its frequency, steady, persistent, undeniable. And that is where romance enters. Because the one Danny would love, the one who could stand beside him, would not need to argue theology or dismantle belief or demand certainty. She would resonate. She would feel right. Her presence would align with the echo the same way the moon aligns with the sun. Cooling when needed, warming when needed, never eclipsing, never overpowering. She would believe in him the way he believes in the moon, and he would believe in her the way he believes in love, not blindly, not naively, but fully. Because in the end, it is not the moon that must be reached, and it is not the ghost that must be chased. It is the echo that must align, and when it does, everything holds. The cult of the moon is not born from rebellion, it's born from fatigue. It forms when parts of the psyche that once served the sun realize that strength alone cannot hold everything together. These are not weak fragments. They are wounded ones. They have seen what power costs. They have stood in the light too long and learned that illumination can burn just as easily as it can guide. So they drift, not away from the sun in hatred, but toward the moon in need. The first to leave are the parts that carry devotion without reciprocity, Loyalty, when it realizes it has been used but not protected. Duty, when it understands that obligation does not equal meaning. Discipline, when it grows tired of never being allowed to rest. Sacrifice, when it asks, what was all this for? These parts served the sun well. They upheld order, they followed rules, they kept the system functioning. But they are the first to realize that survival is not the same as living. So they move toward the moon, not to abandon structure, but to find gentleness within it. At the heart of moon worship are the parts of the psyche that believe connection is as vital as control. Not naive connection, not desperate attachment, but chosen closeness. These are not loud emotions. They do not march. They gather. They sit near fires. They watch the sky. They speak softly but feel deeply. Psychologically, these parts understand something critical. Power can protect the system. Love gives the system a reason. They worship the moon because it reflects rather than demands. Because it does not command loyalty, it invites presence. The moon doesn't say, follow me. It says, stay with me. And for parts of the psyche that have endured war, loss, betrayal, and endurance, that invitation matters. Among the moon worshippers, you'll find hope, no longer loud but stubborn, trust, cautious and conditional, yet still breathing, acceptance, not resignation, but peace with imperfection, belonging, no longer tied to hierarchy, intimacy, emotional rather than physical, empathy, selective but sincere, compassion, not as obligation but as choice. These parts don't deny the dragon. They simply refuse to be ruled only by fire. And those who gather beneath the moon are not loud. They don't argue doctrine. They don't compete for authority. They don't try to convert anyone standing nearby. They arrive quietly and stand a little apart from the rest of the hill, faces turned upward, as if listening for something only they can hear. This is where romance lives, not the performative kind, not fantasy. Romance here is patient, observant, reverent. It watches rather than reaches. It doesn't rush toward love. It studies it, admires it, learns its shape from a distance before ever daring to move closer. Romance stands closest to the firelight, eyes bright, heart open, believing not in possession, but in possibility. Beside it stands longing, not desperate, not needy, but deep. Longing here understands absence. It knows what it is to wait years for something without letting the waiting rot into bitterness. It gazes at the moon as if remembering something it has never had but somehow always known. Yearning is there too, restless but restrained. It shifts its weight from foot to foot, imagining futures, imagining hands fitting together, imagining conversations that feel like home. Yearning doesn't demand fulfillment, it simply refuses to die. A little further back, you'll find fidelity. Fidelity doesn't look up often, it looks inward. It is steady, unmoving, grounded. Fidelity believes in staying, in choosing again and again, in not leaving when the novelty wears off or when the fire dims. Fidelity is the part of Danny that believes love isn't proven in passion, but in consistency. Next to fidelity stands trust, cautious, scarred, but present. Trust here is not naive. It has been broken before. It knows exactly how dangerous belief can be. But it remains anyway, arms crossed, watching carefully, willing to step forward if the resonance feels right. Trust listens more than it speaks. It waits for patterns, not promises. Hope lingers nearby, softer than it used to be. Hope doesn't make declarations anymore. It doesn't shout, this time will be different. Instead, it whispers maybe. Maybe it could work. Maybe not everything ends in loss. Maybe love doesn't always turn into a battlefield. Hope doesn't lead. It follows, quietly behind trust. There is vulnerability here as well, though it tries to stay unseen. Vulnerability doesn't like the open hill. It feels exposed. But it comes anyway, because it knows love cannot exist without risk. It flinches at sudden movement. It braces for disappointment. And yet it remains, because to leave would mean giving up entirely. You'll also find devotion, kneeling not to worship blindly, but to honor connection. Devotion here is not submission. It is choice. It is the willingness to show up emotionally, to invest, to care deeply, knowing it might hurt. Devotion believes love is something you tend, not something you conquer. And scattered among them all is acceptance. Acceptance doesn't idealize love. It understands imperfection. It knows people fail, change, fracture. Acceptance doesn't excuse harm, but it doesn't demand perfection either. It allows love to be human. These parts know Danny created the system, but they do not deify him. They believe in him the way one believes in a person, not a god. They know his contradictions. They accept his sharp edges. They don't seek to convert him, fix him, or tame him. They worship the moon because it represents the possibility that someone could stand beside him without being burned. That's why the lunar ghost belongs here. The lunar ghost is not worshipped by this cult. She is understood by it. She is recognized as what love looks like when it survives proximity to power. Her presence reassures them that belief in love is not foolish, that it can coexist with dominance, intelligence, and danger. She does not lead them. She validates them. And the echo's role is to bind it all together. The echo binds the cult together. It is the shared frequency of recognition, not attraction, not fantasy, but resonance. It is the feeling of yes, this matters. And psychologically, that is why these parts gather here. Because after all the structure, all the war, all the intelligence and control, some parts of the psyche still choose to believe love is not weakness. Love is not surrender. Love is what makes survival worth sustaining. And that belief, fragile, defiant, luminous, belongs to the moon. Beneath Omnist Hill, you can always tell who stands where, not by banners, not by symbols, but by where their attention goes. Those who gather around the sun stand upright, shoulders squared, faces turned inward as much as upward. They don't look for signs, they become them. The sun worshippers are the parts of Danny that believe survival begins with the self. Here you'll find self-respect, immovable, intolerant of erosion. It doesn't negotiate its worth. It doesn't beg to be chosen. It simply is. Beside it stands self-awareness, watchful and sharp, constantly taking inventory, strengths, flaws, patterns, mistakes, not to punish, but to understand. Discipline is here too, quiet and severe, reminding the rest that desire without control leads to collapse. Pride stands tall, not boastful, but unyielding, the refusal to bow where no bow is deserved. And threading through them all is autonomy, the belief that no one else gets to define him. The sun worshippers believe in self-love not as indulgence, but as foundation. They believe you must know yourself before you give yourself away. They believe boundaries are sacred. They believe dignity is non-negotiable. They believe a dragon who forgets himself becomes either a tyrant or prey. They don't ask the sun for permission. They ask it for clarity. Across the hill, not opposed, not hostile, but distinctly different, the moon worshippers gather. They are softer in posture, not weaker, just open. Their focus isn't inward, it's relational, reflective. They look outward and upward, drawn to what connects rather than what fortifies. Where the sun says stand alone first, the moon says stand together if it's safe. The moon worshippers believe in connection. They believe meaning is multiplied when shared. They believe intimacy is worth the danger. They believe love is not possession, but resonance. They believe the right presence doesn't threaten the self, it complements it. And this is the crucial thing. These two groups are not enemies. They are not factions at war. They are counterweights. The sun keeps Danny whole. The moon reminds him why being whole matters. The sun says, know yourself. The moon replies, now be known. The sun demands self-respect. The moon invites shared reverence. Too much sun and he becomes isolated. Powerful, yes, but alone. Too much moon and he risks dissolving himself into someone else. Omnist Hill exists because both are true. Danny stands among them, not choosing sides, not converting one to the other, but believing in both. And that is why love for him is never about abandoning the self. It is about finding someone whose gravity doesn't eclipse the sun, but reflects it. That is how Omnist Hill works as a whole, not as belief, not as doctrine, but as pressure regulation for a mind that carries too much awareness to kneel to a single truth. For a dragon Capricorn, belief cannot be naive. Dragons see too far, too wide. They notice contradictions, patterns, hypocrisies. Capricorn demands structure, accountability, coherence, and schizophrenia adds multiplicity, not confusion, but simultaneous perception. Many perspectives alive at once. If faith lived in the library, it would be dissected to death. If it lived in the court, it would be argued into irrelevance. If it lived in the throne room, it would rot into ego. So it is placed on a hill, high enough to be respected, separate enough to remain optional, solid enough to be returned to. Omnist Hill allows Danny to believe without surrendering reason, to listen without obeying, to feel awe without dissolving into fanaticism. It gives spirituality somewhere to exist without contaminating logic or hijacking identity. It is visited when guidance is needed, not clung to out of fear. This is crucial psychology. A schizophrenic mind cannot afford blind devotion. A dragon cannot afford weakness masked as faith. A Capricorn cannot tolerate systems without checks. So Omnist Hill becomes a meeting ground, not a command center. A place where gods speak, stories breathe, symbols move, but none rule absolutely. Even Danny approaches it stripped of crown and command, not as king, but as seeker. That balance is what keeps the system sane. Faith is allowed, but never unchecked. Mysticism is honored, but never absolute. Love is revered, but never weaponized. And because of that, Omnist Hill does not destabilize the fortress. It anchors it. Fact has its place. Faith has its hill. And now, deeper within the fortress, something else waits. Not logic, not belief, but imagination. And with it, creativity, memory, softness. The place where ideas bloom rather than argue. The gardens are next.